What German pilots said when 1,000 British fighters met them over the channel. The cockpit of Oberleutnant Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt Bf 109 smelled of hot oil and sweat. It was 11:45 on the morning of September 15, 1940, and Stigler was climbing hard over the French coast near Calais, leading his schwarm through broken cloud. Behind him stretched a formation so vast it defied comprehension. Over 200 Dornier and Heinkel bombers, each laden with high explosives meant for London. Above, below, and on both flanks flew nearly 500 fighters, sleek 109s and the twin-engine 110s, all tasked with escorting the bombers through what intelligence assured them would be light, scattered resistance. Stigler checked his fuel gauge. The red warning light glowed faintly, a constant reminder that his fighter could manage perhaps 20 minutes over England before the Merlin would start coughing. 20 minutes to shepherd the bombers, engage whatever broken RAF squadrons rose to meet them, and turn for home. The briefing that morning had been confident. The RAF has perhaps 200 serviceable fighters remaining, the intelligence officer had said, jabbing at a map with his pointer. One more decisive blow, gentlemen, and fighter command collapses. Then the coast of England materialized through the haze. What Stigler saw in the next 60 seconds would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not scattered pairs of fighters struggling into position, not depleted squadrons limping up from battered airfields. Instead, the sky over Kent erupted with aircraft. Hurricane after hurricane, Spitfire after Spitfire, climbing in tight formations of 12, 20, 30 at a time. They came from the north, they came from the east, they came head-on. The radio frequency exploded with German voices, urgent, disbelieving. Where are they all coming from? There must be hundreds. They told us the RAF was finished. Stigler's wingman screamed something incomprehensible as a Spitfire flashed past barely 50 meters away. The neat bomber formations began to ripple and break, and Franz Stigler, who had believed what his commanders told him, who had flown confidently across the channel thinking victory was days away, suddenly understood with cold, sinking certainty that everything, every assumption, every intelligence report, every promise had been catastrophically wrong. The question on September 15, 1940, wasn't whether Britain could defend itself. It was whether Germany could survive the shock of discovering it had never understood its enemy at all. To understand the horror that seized German air crews over Kent that Sunday morning, you have to go back 8 days. On September the 7th, Hermann Goering had stood on the cliffs at Cap Blanc-Neige, binoculars raised, watching the first massive raid on London unfold. Nearly 1,000 aircraft, the largest aerial assault in history, darkened the sky as they turned northeast toward the British capital. Goering was grinning. Beside him, his staff officers exchanged confident glances. After 2 months of grinding combat, the Reichsmarshal had changed strategy. No more attacking radar stations, no more bombing fighter airfields. Now they would strike at London itself, force the RAF to commit its last reserves in defense of the city, and annihilate fighter command in one final decisive battle. The intelligence seemed to support it. Reports flowing into Luftwaffe headquarters spoke of catastrophic British losses. Airfields cratered, squadrons decimated, pilot casualties mounting. Major Josef Pips Schmid, Chief of Luftwaffe Intelligence, had submitted an assessment estimating RAF Fighter Command possessed no more than 200 operational aircraft. German bomber crews, returning from raids on August the 31st and September 1st, reported encountering weaker resistance with each mission. Some formations reached their targets virtually unopposed. "They're down to their last reserves," Schmid insisted during a September 6 planning session in Paris. "One more heavy blow will break them." What Schmid didn't know, what German intelligence had catastrophically failed to grasp, was that while they'd been bombing London, British fighter production had surged. Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production was delivering new Hurricanes and Spitfires faster than the Germans were destroying them. Damaged aircraft were being repaired and returned to squadrons within days, and the shift away from bombing RAF airfields had given Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's fighter command precisely what it needed most: time to recover. In the underground operations room at Bentley Priory, Dowding stood before the massive plotting table on the evening of September 14th, watching Women's Auxiliary Air Force officers push markers representing his available squadrons. His face, always severe, showed nothing. But the numbers told their own story. Fighter Command now had more serviceable aircraft than it had possessed on August 13th, when the Germans launched their all-out assault on southern England. Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, responsible for defending London and the southeast, had spent the week repositioning squadrons, rotating exhausted units out of the front line, and preparing for what he knew must come. The Germans would try again. They always did, and when they came, Park intended to meet them with everything he had. That night, across the Channel, German bomber crews were briefed for Sunday's mission. Hauptmann Rolf Heitsch, a Dornier pilot with KG-76, sat in a crowded briefing room in Cormeilles-en-Vexin, listening to his squadron commander outline the target, London's docklands and railway infrastructure. The intelligence officer repeated the now familiar assessment. The RAF is nearly finished. You should encounter minimal resistance. Heitsch glanced at his radio operator, Feldwebel Otto Birnbacher. Neither man spoke. They'd flown over England a dozen times in the past month. The resistance had never felt minimal, but orders were orders, and no one questioned Goering. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 15th, Heitsch stood beneath the wing of his Dornier, smoking a cigarette. The air smelled of aviation fuel and damp grass. Around him, mechanics made final checks, loading bombs, fueling tanks. France had been conquered, Poland crushed, the Low Countries occupied, Britain stood alone. One more push, everyone said. Just one more. Heitsch flicked his cigarette into the grass and climbed into the cockpit. He didn't feel confident. He felt tired and worried, and waiting for whatever would come. What came was every German airman's nightmare. 11:30 a.m., chain home radar stations along the Kent coast began picking up returns, large formations building over the Pas de Calais. At Bentley Priory, WAF plotters leaned over the massive table, moving markers labeled Hostile 40+, as reports streamed in from radar operators, then Hostile 80+, then Hostile 100+. Keith Park, visiting the operations room, watched the plots develop. He knew this pattern. The Germans were committing everything. "Scramble all available squadrons," he ordered. Across 11 airfields in southern England, the command went out. At RAF Biggin Hill, Hurricane pilots of 72 Squadron were sprinting toward their aircraft before the operations officer finished speaking. At Northolt, Polish pilots of 303 Squadron, men who'd escaped Warsaw, who'd watched their homeland crushed, ran with a particular ferocity. At Tangmere, at Kenley, at Croydon, at Hornchurch, the scene repeated itself. Pilots pulling on helmets, ground crews cranking starters, Merlin engines coughing to life in rapid succession. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, commanding 242 Squadron at Duxford, led his big wing south, 5 squadrons flying in formation, 60 aircraft in a massive aerial phalanx. It was controversial tactics. Some argued it took too long to form up, but when it worked, when that many fighters arrived together, the psychological impact on German bomber crews was devastating. 11:42 a.m., the first German formations crossed the coast near Dover and ran straight into the RAF. Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Marseille, flying a 109 with JG-27, saw them first. 12 Hurricanes diving from 8,000 feet head-on into his bomber formation. He shouted a warning, broke left, and suddenly the sky was full of aircraft. Everywhere he looked, British fighters, more than he'd ever seen in one place. They weren't scattered, they weren't disorganized. They came in squadron strength, hitting the bombers from multiple angles. Behind him, a Dornier shed pieces, trailing black smoke. Another bomber pulled out of formation, one engine feathered. The radio frequency became chaos. German pilots calling out positions, trying to coordinate, increasingly frantic. Where did they all come from? We were told, "Break left. Break left!" Franz Stigler, leading his schwarm through the maelstrom, felt his chest tighten. There weren't dozens of British fighters. There were hundreds. They filled the sky like angry hornets, tearing into the bomber formations with a savagery that spoke not of desperation but of confidence. These weren't the last gasps of a defeated force. This was fighter command at strength, fully coordinated, fighting on home ground with radar guidance and fuel to burn. Stigler latched onto a Hurricane's tail, fired a burst, saw hits sparkle along the wing. The British fighter rolled away trailing smoke, but another was already there, forcing Stigler into a defensive turn. His fuel light glowed brighter, and 10 minutes left, maybe 15. In the bombers, crews watched their carefully rehearsed formations disintegrate. Rolf Heitsch, gripping his Dornier's control yoke, struggled to maintain position as Hurricanes slashed through the group. His bombardier, pressed against the plexiglass nose, shouted coordinates, but Heitsch could barely hear him over the hammering of defensive machine guns. To his right, a Heinkel exploded, just came apart in mid-air, pieces tumbling earthward. To his left, another bomber was falling, one wing sheared off. "Stay together!" the formation leader kept repeating over the radio. "Stay together!" But they couldn't. The British fighters were everywhere. 12:05 p.m., the first German formations reached London, or what should have been London. Cloud cover obscured landmarks. Under relentless fighter attack, many bombardiers simply salvoed their loads over southeast London suburbs and turned for home. Bombs fell on residential areas, Railway lines, parks. Some hit docks. Most caused scattered damage, nothing strategic. The primary objective, to devastate London's port infrastructure and break civilian morale, was failing. And the British fighters kept coming. Pilot Officer David Cox of 19 Squadron caught a Dornier in his gun sight, fired a 3-second burst, and watched the bomber's port engine burst into flames. The German crew bailed out. 1, 2, 3, 4 parachutes blossoming white against the blue. Cox didn't feel triumph, just grim satisfaction. He'd been flying combat missions since July. He was exhausted, but today, finally, Fighter Command had the numbers to meet the Germans on equal terms. Today they could hurt them badly. By 12:30, the first wave of German aircraft was streaming back toward France, harried every mile by RAF fighters. German pilots, hunched in their cockpits, eyes darting to fuel gauges. Some 109s wouldn't make it. Ditching in the Channel was almost certain death. In the operations room at 11 Group headquarters, Keith Park watched the plots develop. The Germans were turning back, but radar was already picking up another massive formation building over France. The second wave was coming. 1:45 p.m. If the morning raid had been enormous, the afternoon attack was apocalyptic. Over 250 German bombers and 700 fighters crossed the Channel in multiple waves, each formation layered with escorts, heading for London from different angles to overwhelm the defenders. But Keith Park had rotated his squadrons. Fresh pilots scrambled from forward airfields. Douglas Bader's big wing, refueled and rearmed, climbed south again. Even 12 group squadrons from the Midlands joined the battle, something almost unprecedented. Winston Churchill himself was in 11 Group's operations room, standing behind Park, watching the drama unfold on the plotting table. Every squadron marker on the board was in motion, every available fighter committed to battle. "What reserves do we have?" Churchill asked. Park's reply was simple and terrifying. "There are none." For the next 2 hours, the sky over London and Kent became a three-dimensional battlefield spanning 30,000 feet and 50 miles. Pilot Officer Geoffrey Page, flying a Hurricane with 56 Squadron, later described it as the most intense air combat I ever experienced. You couldn't look in any direction without seeing aircraft fighting, burning, falling. German bomber formations, already shaken by the morning's losses, found themselves under even heavier attack. RAF fighters dove through the escorts, broke up the tight defensive boxes and savaged individual bombers. Feldwebel Rudolf Heitsch, piloting a Dornier, felt his aircraft shudder as cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. His radio operator slumped forward, blood spreading across his uniform. The starboard engine was overheating. Heitsch knew he wouldn't make France. He turned south anyway, nursing the crippled bomber, praying. He crash-landed in a field near Shoreham, the Dornier ploughing through a fence before coming to rest. Heitsch climbed out, pulled his dying radio operator from the wreckage, and collapsed. British soldiers found them 30 minutes later. Above the battle, Franz Stigler was out of fuel. His warning light had been glowing red for 5 minutes. He'd broken away from combat, diving hard for France, pushing his 109 to maximum speed. The Channel stretched below. Grey, cold, unforgiving. If the engine quit now, he was dead. It didn't quit. At 3:10 p.m., Stigler crossed the French coast on fumes and landed at his airfield with an engine that coughed twice before dying. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, unable to move. Around him, other fighters were landing, or not landing. Empty hardstands marked aircraft that wouldn't return. In the crew-ready room, pilots stood in stunned clusters. No one spoke. What was there to say? They'd been promised the RAF was finished. Instead, they'd flown into a buzzsaw. The losses hadn't been determined yet, but everyone knew this was catastrophic. By 4:00 p.m., the last German aircraft limped across the Channel. British fighters, many low on ammunition and fuel, broke off pursuit. In the underground operations rooms, WAF plotters removed the last hostile tracks from the boards. The all-clear sounded over London. Civilians emerged from shelters to find their city battered but intact, the docks still functioning, the railways still running. The Battle of Britain's climax had passed, and Germany had lost. That evening, at Luftflotte 2 headquarters in Brussels, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring sat in his office, reading loss reports. Initial estimates suggested 60 aircraft destroyed, with another 30 damaged beyond immediate repair. But the numbers kept climbing. Crews that should have returned were missing. Bombers had ditched in the Channel, fighters had crash-landed in France. Worse than the numbers was the morale report. His staff intelligence officer's assessment was blunt. Bomber crews are badly shaken. Many expressed doubt that another major daylight attack is feasible given current RAF strength. Kesselring stared at the page. RAF strength. The phrase mocked him. Everything, the entire strategy of the past month, had been predicated on the assumption that the RAF was nearly defeated, and it had been wrong, catastrophically, dangerously wrong. At Carinhall, Hermann Göring's palatial estate outside Berlin, the Reichsmarshal received the preliminary reports around 8:00 p.m. He read them once, then again, his face darkening. When his aide suggested perhaps the intelligence estimates had been optimistic, Göring exploded. Optimistic? We were told Fighter Command had 200 aircraft. We faced twice that many. More! But anger couldn't change the facts. Major Josef Schmid's intelligence assessments, which had guided Luftwaffe strategy for weeks, had been comprehensively wrong. The RAF hadn't been on the brink of collapse. They'd been recovering, rebuilding, preparing, and on September 15th, they demonstrated it with brutal clarity. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received Kesselring's report late that evening. He read it without comment, then summoned his military staff. The discussion that followed was brief. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, already troubled by logistics problems and bad weather forecasts, was effectively finished. On September 17th, Hitler issued the formal order. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. The decision rippled through Wehrmacht headquarters with quiet shock. For the first time since September 1939, German military planning had suffered a major strategic defeat, not a tactical setback, not a temporary delay, an actual, undeniable failure. The Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority over Britain. Without air superiority, no invasion was possible. Without invasion, Britain would remain in the war, a dagger pointed at Europe's western flank. In London, Winston Churchill learned of the day's claimed successes. 26 German aircraft destroyed, the Air Ministry announced, and allowed himself a rare smile. The actual figure was lower, 61 confirmed kills, but the strategic result was identical. Fighter Command had held. Britain would not be invaded. The immediate crisis was over. That night, Churchill composed a message to Air Chief Marshal Dowding. All our hearts go out to the fighter pilots whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes every day. At RAF Hornchurch, squadron leader Brian Lane sat in the officers' mess, nursing a whiskey. His hands still trembled slightly, adrenaline aftershocks. He'd flown 4 sorties that day, engaged German aircraft in 3 separate combats, and lost 2 pilots from his squadron. 1 confirmed dead, 1 missing, probably in the Channel. But they'd turned back the Germans, broken their formations, sent them reeling back to France. Lane thought about the German pilots he'd fought. Young men, well-trained, brave, men who'd believed their commanders when told victory was certain, men who'd discovered today, in the most brutal way possible, that they'd been lied to. In France, Franz Stigler sat alone in his quarters, writing a letter he would never send. We were told the RAF was defeated, he wrote. Today we learned the truth. They were not defeated, they were waiting, and they were stronger than anyone told us. I don't know what happens now, but I know we cannot win against an enemy we don't understand. Across the Channel, 2 nations settled into a new reality. For Britain, the relief was profound but cautious. Fighter Command had won the day, but the war was far from over. German bombers would return, at night now when fighters were less effective, beginning the blitz that would terrorize British cities for months. But the invasion threat was broken. Britain would survive. For Germany, the shock rippled through the ranks. Officers who'd promised swift victory now faced hard questions. How had intelligence been so wrong? How had the RAF recovered so quickly? Most fundamentally, if Britain couldn't be defeated by air power, how could it be defeated at all? The answer, increasingly apparent, was that it couldn't. Not quickly, not decisively, not without a protracted struggle that would drain resources needed for Hitler's grand Eastern ambitions. The Battle of Britain hadn't just saved Britain, it had ensured that Germany would face a 2-front war when, inevitably, Hitler turned east toward the Soviet Union. September 15, 1940, revealed something profound about modern warfare and the limits of military intelligence. The Luftwaffe had been a superb tactical force, well-trained, well-equipped, battle-tested in Poland, France, and Norway. But it had operated throughout the Battle of Britain under a fundamental strategic delusion. The belief that they understood their enemy's strength. They didn't. German intelligence had consistently underestimated RAF fighter production, misunderstood the Dowding system's effectiveness, and failed to appreciate how radar and ground control allowed the British to husband their forces and concentrate them at critical points. Luftwaffe commanders believed their own inflated kill claims, and subordinates who questioned the intelligence assessments were ignored or dismissed. The result was a strategic miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. Germany committed its air force to a campaign it couldn't win, against an enemy it didn't understand, based on intelligence that was systematically wrong. And when German pilots finally confronted the truth, On September 15th, when they flew expecting light resistance and met overwhelming force, it shattered not just formations, but confidence. This wasn't about bravery. German aircrews were as brave as any in history. It was about leadership failure. Hermann Göring's arrogance, Josef Schmid's incompetent intelligence work, and Hitler's impatience combined to doom Operation Sea Lion before it began. The Luftwaffe paid the price in blood and broken morale. For Britain, September 15th demonstrated what coordinated defense could achieve. The Dowding system, integrating radar, ground observers, fighter control rooms, and pilots, represented a revolution in air warfare. It multiplied the effectiveness of fighter command's limited resources, allowing outnumbered forces to achieve tactical superiority at critical moments. The system's architect, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, would later be sidelined and underappreciated by the British establishment. But his legacy was written in the sky over Kent that Sunday, a defensive network so effective it stopped the most powerful air force in the world. The battle also revealed something about national character under pressure. British pilots and ground crews, exhausted after 2 months of continuous combat, found reserves of determination when the crisis reached its peak. Polish, Czech, Canadian, and other Allied pilots fighting in RAF squadrons brought not just skill but a fierce hatred of fascism that translated into exceptional combat performance. Women operating radar sets and plotting boards proved as crucial to victory as the men in the cockpits. Most fundamentally, September 15th marked the moment when Hitler's war of conquest reached its first genuine limit. Germany could defeat nations quickly through combined arms, tactics, and overwhelming force. But it couldn't defeat an island nation with a modern air defense system, a resilient civilian population, and pilots willing to die to defend it. That limitation would define the rest of the war. Britain would remain unconquered, a base for eventual Allied liberation of Europe. The Eastern Front would open without the Western threat eliminated. And Germany, which had seemed invincible in the summer of 1940, would discover that invincibility was an illusion. 3 weeks after the battle, Franz Stigler sat in his squadron-ready room, listening to a new intelligence briefing. The officer spoke confidently about renewed offensive operations, weakened British defenses, opportunities for decisive action. Stigler exchanged glances with his wingman. Neither man said anything, but both knew the truth. They'd seen the RAF over Kent on September 15th. Not the remnants of a defeated force, not scattered squadrons fighting desperately, but fighter-commanded strength, coordinated, confident, ready. And that image wouldn't leave them. Every time intelligence promised victory was near, they'd remember that Sunday morning when the sky filled with British fighters that weren't supposed to exist. In the months that followed, as the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, as losses mounted and replacements dwindled, the psychological wound inflicted on September 15th never fully healed. German air crews had learned that their commanders could be catastrophically wrong, that intelligence could lie, that assurances of easy victory could transform into desperate survival. Trust, once broken, is hard to restore. On the evening of September 15th, as darkness fell over southern England, a young Hurricane pilot named James Hallows walked out to his aircraft's revetment. The ground crew had patched bullet holes in the wing and replaced the starboard aileron. The fighter would fly again tomorrow. Hallows ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal. 4 times that day he'd taken off. 4 times he'd climbed into combat. 4 times he'd returned. 2 members of his squadron hadn't, but they'd held. Against everything Germany threw at them, they'd held. Hallows looked east, toward the Channel, toward France and the German airfields beyond. Somewhere over there, enemy pilots were settling into uneasy sleep, processing what they'd experienced, wondering what came next. Hallows wondered too, but he felt something they didn't. Certainty. Certainty that Britain would not fall. That fighter command, battered and exhausted, had done what was asked of it. The invasion wouldn't come, the island would stand, and somewhere in the future, months away, maybe years, this day would be remembered as the moment when the tide turned, when a small force of determined pilots, supported by radar operators and ground crews and the entire machinery of integrated air defense, proved that technology and courage could defeat numerical superiority. Hallows turned back toward the dispersal hut, where his fellow pilots were already gathering for the evening, the way they did every evening, laughing too loud, drinking too fast, pretending not to notice the empty chairs. He didn't know how many more days like September 15 he'd survive. None of them did. But he knew this. When German pilots looked into the sky over England and saw not scarcity but abundance, not defeat but strength, the myth of German invincibility had died. And sometimes, killing a myth is enough to change history. The war would continue, the bombing would intensify, more pilots would die, But the question that had haunted Britain since Dunkirk, whether the island could hold alone, had been answered, not with speeches or propaganda, but with Merlin engines and 8-gun fighters and radar plots, and young men who flew beyond exhaustion because there was no choice. September 15th, 1940, the day German pilots saw 1,000 British fighters when they'd been promised 200. The day certainty became doubt. The day invasion became impossible. Battle of Britain Day, the day that changed everything.